is Holden Sparacino. Holden is finishing his first year as a master's student working with Dr. Chris Stepnick to assess the barriers and motivations of winter maintenance private contractors in the Lake Champlain Basin to using best management practices that reduce application materials. Through his research, he is happy to be continuing from previous work in the field of community-based participatory research to assess water quality impacts. And outside Rubenstein can be found hiking, biking, or enjoying breakfast. Two truths and a lie for Holden. Before going car-free years ago, Holden was a proud owner of a pickup truck with a V8. Holden has technically been to outer space via a high-altitude plane flight. Well, totally not. Holden once shattered a tooth during a sporting event and swallowed the pieces. And his presentation will be titled Winter Maintenance Best Practices, Identifying and Lowering Private Contractors' Barriers to Adoption.
Okay. Thanks. Thanks, Kenna, for the introduction. So yeah, I'm going to take you through some of my research thus far. First, giving a little bit of a background on sodium chloride impacts and rising use of road salt, and then taking you through a little bit of mixed methods designed using social marketing towards influencing some behavior changes. So first, some background. We are using a lot more road salt than we used to. This is from 1975 to about I think 2016 is also on there. In past years, we've used about 20 to 25 million metric tons of road salt across the U.S., so this is increasing. There are also studies showing that as urbanization increases and impervious surfaces increase, there's a higher likelihood of chloride impacts, thanks to some research done by Dr. Morales-Williams. But there's also some research showing that kind of in spite of ourselves, even when accounting for increased urbanization, we are still using more salt than we used to on our roads. So that's kind of to set the stage. Taking it a little bit more zoomed in, looking at Lake Champlain Basin. The basin is about 8,200 square miles, and we have actually a very high ratio of total land to water. It's about 19-to-1 ratio for Lake Champlain versus the basin, the basin versus Lake Champlain, compared to around the Great Lakes, which is around a 4-to-1 ratio. So this area is more highly susceptible possibly from land use impacts, and there's around 300 tributaries leading to Lake Champlain as well. So right now, the mean chloride concentration is around 11.5 milligrams per liter. This is increasing, however, but it's still far below the EPA thresholds for chronic and acute concentrations of chloride. So the takeaway here is we are increasing chloride concentrations, but we are still below the threshold, so there's kind of time to act. Another important thing to note is that chloride removal isn't really an attainable way to deal with this issue. It's just not a feasible method, so really working towards preventative methods is more the way to go. There are also instances in the Lake Champlain Basin, like Mud Creek, that are showing thresholds closer to the chronic levels, but the mean chloride concentration is still relatively low. So some environmental impacts from increased salinity. As those chloride concentrations rise, we see impacts to community diversity and also drinking water risks, especially at those higher levels for private landowners or private well owners, for instance. There are also several soil and vegetative impacts. So for soils, possibly releasing heavy metals, and for vegetation, just general increased salinity is not good for vegetation. As I noted before, removal not quite an option, so working towards those preventative measures. But there's good news. There are best management practices that are being implemented by municipalities These typically include reducing application materials through more physical removal processes or through increased efficiencies from either equipment or information gathering or weather measuring, also surface temperature measuring, that kind of thing, as well as using alternative application materials in their mixtures. So to quickly go through some of these, anti-icing is applying the road salt before the storm, so preventing bonds from occurring rather than trying to melt through those. Calibrating equipment or using equipment that has variable application rates, again, just upping that efficiency and making sure the equipment is used how it should be being used. Using alternative additives, so there are different chemical mixtures that can be used. Also, salt brine can be used, just mixing salt with water, again, reducing the overall sodium chloride. And then technology, just weather information systems using predictive technologies or measuring the surface temperature as the truck goes along to know what application rate to use, that kind of thing. Another big one that I'm kind of curious about is usage expectations as well. So whether or not somebody expects to be driving on a dry road the entire winter versus whether it's reasonable to say maybe the road's going to be a little bit wet, but that obviously has less materials that need to be used with it. So what about private contractors? So private contractors, they might manage commercial parking lots, driveways, private roads, a lot of sidewalks as well, throughout the basin and elsewhere, but we don't know a lot about the size of the areas they're maintaining or their materials or their practices. They are not as well documented as some of these municipalities I talked about. So their service area, what types of areas do they maintain and how big are those areas? What materials are they using? We can assume that they're probably using sodium chloride or sand mostly, but again, we don't know that. And what practices are they using? Are they using all of these best management practices or are they using some of them? And then all of those leading into assessing their barriers to reduced salt activities. So some of these we can some of these we can look at the literature and get an idea of. For example, the literature tells us that private contractors are going to be economically motivated, so they're going to use practices that are cheaper, all things being equal, and also they are resistant to increases in liability, right? So they might use more materials because they don't want to be prone to slip and fall lawsuits, for instance. So one of the things I'm going to be looking at is if we can use social marketing and outreach towards one of those barriers being reduced, of showing that best management practices can reduce material use, therefore reducing their economic costs, while also providing a similar level of service, thereby reducing that concern over liability. So the study is a mixed methods approach using quantitative and qualitative data. So the quantitative data comes in the form of a survey, identifying those barriers for the community, assessing their practices, their materials used. Right now we have a list of around 200 companies throughout the Lake Champlain Basin that will be surveyed in a kind of a census approach. And part of that also will be, the questionnaire includes a lot about their barriers to change based on what they tell us, what practices they're currently using. Then we'll be using a focus group later on to both refine some of those barriers and explain them a little better, while also piloting an outreach campaign using social marketing techniques. So, second time I've said that, social marketing. What is social marketing? Good question. This is a technique that's been used by a lot of different outreach campaigns, for a lot of different purposes, a lot of environmental, but not necessarily environmental causes. It targets a specific behavior to change and a specific audience to change that behavior, and then uses voluntary changes in that behavior to incite change. So this sometimes can be both direct and indirect contact with the audience. This can be, informational campaigns, workshops, that kind of thing, training, all sorts of things that really reduce those barriers. And then also this inherent feedback loop with social marketing is that you work directly with the community's members once there's a pilot survey or once there's a pilot outreach campaign to refine and kind of refresh. So this will be used with that qualitative data especially to pilot the study and then move forward towards creating the behavior change. Another thing to note about social marketing is it's voluntary behavior, right? So this is a way to not engage in the legal system, not force people to change, but to kind of play to their wants and desires and see if there's some kind of ground that you can both stand on and move forward in. So kind of giving a general overview there, there's 3 objectives to this study. 1, to characterize the community through those quantitative and qualitative data, and 2, I used especially the qualitative data to refine those barriers and motivations to change, and then 3, work directly with the community members through social marketing, possibly with trainings, that kind of thing, to promote behavior change that reduce salt use in the Lake Champlain Basin. Thanks real quick to NOAA, Sea Grant, Lake Champlain Sea Grant, University of Vermont Extension, and the Rubenstein School. Thanks also to my committee members, Dr. Chris Stucknook, Dr. Rochelle Gould, and Dr. Stephanie Hurley for all their help and support thus far in the process. Here's some references. And I can take any questions.
Two-part question. One is, since we're so below the threshold,
Mm-hmm.
have we seen impacts at that low level?
In specific waterways, yes. I don't know if, like Champlain-wide, there would be some of those aquatic community impacts quite yet, but the trend is increasing. So it's predicted that a lot of lakes, or multiple lakes over the U.S., will be past those thresholds in the next 50 years. So.
And then for our context, since that is an average, are there hotspots, like you said, specific waterways, or specific tributaries or impacts that?
Yeah, there are a few. I'd have to look at specifically which ones, but again, the more impervious surfaces tend to have more of those impacts and more salt use.
Related to the previous question, given that there may be hotspots of use, are there certain counties or regions that you are focusing in on that you know receive a lot of
Yeah, we're blanketing the entire Lake Champlain Basin, so corner to corner, up and down. Part of that is that we're trying to assess the total area that is covered by private contractors. So you could do a survey that just samples, a set number, kind of a random sampling, but because we also want that number of total usage, we're trying to do as close to a census as possible. So, yeah.
Perhaps you addressed this, but since you're looking at the whole basin, that includes New York, Vermont,
Mm-hmm.
and Canada.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Are the management practices between those areas different, like really different, or are they pretty similar?
Yeah, I think it, well, again, so it might differ municipality to municipality, but I'm really looking at the private contractors,
Right.
and it's really unknown what practices they're following. So,
You just said that you're trying to maybe have contractors follow best practices, and I guess I was wondering what those would be.
oh yeah, there's several. There's many best management practices that can be followed. So I think I named some of them, but you could additionally, let's see, I said anti-icing. Using brine is another one that's really big. Calibrating equipment is something that's fairly simple and we think might be effective with private contractors. Really focusing in on what practices can they implement without the purchase of additional equipment, that kind of thing. Maybe implemented with a weather information system and putting surface temperature monitors on all their trucks might not be as feasible, but if we can get them to map out where they're going to go and salt the roads before the storm rather than after, those kinds of things we think can be an effective way to reduce some of that use. Yeah.
When you talked about characterizing the study community,
Mhm.
should private contractors see themselves as a cohesive community? And if not, how do you justify characterizing them as such for the research?
So I guess, good question. I'm not sure if they see each other as a community per se, however they would define that, but in my context, I'm really trying to see, if there are different practices that are more used than others. So with social marketing, you really are going to pick out, a very slim set, if even multiple behaviors to focus on. So really using that to find the top couple behaviors that we think can change, and then probably forming, again, focusing in on whoever isn't using those practices. I don't know if that answered your question fully or not. Kind of. Okay.